everybody. I'm Howard Green, your moderator for today, and I'm also a proud member of the Canadian Business History Association, which, if you don't know, is an organization dedicated to the pursuit of Canadian business history and its role both domestically and in world business history. So if you haven't already joined, please join. We always like to use these occasions to round up a few more members. You can go to our website, CBHA's website, to do so. I also want to mention that this is being recorded. You may have seen that pop up on your screen. But before anything else, I'd like to thank our series sponsor, which is National Bank of Canada. Now, today's discussion focuses on one of the most exciting business stories of the year. That's why you're all here. It's the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Southern transaction. And we're going to talk about it in the context of the history of the railroad industry. A little quick recap, if I may, just because so much has happened. Let's go back to last March. That's when CP bid for Kansas City Southern, the first bid, after some rattlings from the private equity industry a year or so before. In any case, first FYI here, KCS is the smallest of the 7 Class 1 railroads, and CP is the next smallest. And then the second FYI I want to mention, KCS goes into Mexico, which is a significant factor given the new trade deal, the USMCA, and the trend towards onshoring. And then the third FYI, there haven't been any Class 1 mergers since CN bought Illinois Central back in 1998, a transformational transaction, I should say, for Canadian National. That was followed a few years later by a moratorium from the key regulator in the rail industry, the STB, the Surface Transportation Board. Anyway, very soon after CP's bid last spring, CN, its century-old rival, came in with a higher bid for KCS. And in the wake of that, I have never quite heard a conference call like the one CP CEO Keith Creel gave in response to CN bettering its bid. And by the way, for those of you who don't know the history, Keith Creel used to work for CN as chief operating officer until his mentor, Hunter Harrison, lured him away to CP in 2013. Now then, believe it or not, CN even upped its own bid. And CN, by the way, just from an historical point of view, had looked at KCS for a long time, going back to at least 1999 that I know of, when Paul Tellier was CEO of CN. But Hunter Harrison, who'd come from Illinois Central to be COO of CN, had waved Tellier off KCS. And then Tellier went after Burlington Northern Santa Fe, which was actually the transaction that led to the moratorium by the STB. Hunter himself had tried a couple of major transactions when he was running CP to try to buy other railroads, CSX and Norfolk Southern, but both of those attempts failed. He had also, I understand, looked at KCS, but had passed on that again. Anyhow, this summer, the STB ruled against Canadian National and its application for a voting trust, which is a mechanism to close the transaction pending final regulatory approval. And that's when CP jumped back in and snagged KCS, which had previously cast off CP in favor of the higher bid from CN. So it was quite a drama. In any case, the deal still requires final STB approval, but if consummated, it will be a huge achievement for CP and specifically Keith Creel, pulling off the big transaction that his mentor, Hunter Harrison, could not. So that's the background. Today's session will be about an hour in all. And we have three terrific panelists who will each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for you. So please type your questions into the chat, and I'll try to get to as many as we can. Now, let me introduce our speakers. For historical perspective, we have Tom Murray joining us today from Santa Rosa, California. Tom has worked in the industry since 1970 at multiple railroads. He's also been a transportation consultant and regular contributor to Trains, that very widely read publication on the rail industry, and also written 5 railroad books. He'll tell us how this transaction fits into to the industry history around specifically 5 historic events. And we will also have Gordon Lovegrove. He's an associate professor at UBC's School of Engineering Faculty of Applied Science. He joins us today from Kelowna, BC. And Gordon will bring us up to speed on the issues for rail right now: environmental, technology, financial, labor, and competitive, and how this transaction dovetails with all of those. Specifically, Gordon is at the leading edge of research into zero emission rail systems, so relevant as we head to this COP26 conference in a few days. And finally, from a market perspective, we have Cameron Dirksen in Montreal. He's a director and research analyst of transportation and industrials at National Bank Financial Wealth Management. As I said, he's in Montreal, and he'll help us understand the market dynamics of this, what the transaction means for investors, how it could reshape the industry, and what challenges we should be watching for in all of this. So we got a lot to get through here, but I want to go first to the historical perspective and to Tom in California. Tom, why don't you take it away for us and how all of this fits into industry history, first of all?
All right. Thank you, Howard. As Howard mentioned, I began my rail career in 1970. And that was a time when the industry, as it turned out, was on the threshold of great changes. However, at the time, there was more uncertainty than anything else about whether the industry even had a future. My first employer was the Boston and Maine Railroad in my hometown of Worcester, Massachusetts. It had declared bankruptcy 3 months before I started working there. I started in June of 1970. In March, they had declared bankruptcy. And when I got my first paycheck, I was a little taken aback to read at the top that it was issued by Boston and Maine Corporation debtor. I wondered if anybody would cash such a check. As it turned out, that wasn't a problem, but it did give me pause. Now, 3 weeks after I started, later in June, came a much bigger event in terms of rail history, and that was the bankruptcy of Penn Central, which had been formed from the combination in 1968 of the New York Central and the Pennsylvania railroads. At the time, this was the largest corporate bankruptcy in US history. These events and the numerous other Northeastern and Midwestern bankruptcies in the US that followed foreshadowed a period of more than 10 years of downsizing, restructuring, and changes in the way the government treated the rail industry. 2 key milestones along the way were the formation of Conrail in 1976, consolidating the assets of several of the bankrupt Northeastern railroads, principally Penn Central, but several of the other connecting railroads that had likewise gone into bankruptcy in the early 70s. And then there was the passage of the Staggers Rail Act in 1980, which loosened government regulation of US railroads and gave them new freedoms in deciding what services they could provide and what they would charge their customers. The new emphasis was on profitability and return on investment rather than public service. There was a wave of mergers and consolidations starting in the late 1970s and continuing through the first decade of this century. Now I'd like to turn to Canada and to CP's proposed purchase of KCS. I think this is potentially the last major step in the remaking of the North American railway map. But let's look back at some of the events in the Canadian rail industry that have gotten us to this point. And I'm looking way back because things that happened in the 1880s still have repercussions today. The first on my list is the completion of CP's transcontinental route in 1885. The history of CP is in some ways the history of Canada itself. It helped knit together the loose amalgamation of provinces in British North America and assured that British Columbia would be brought into confederation with the eastern provinces. Number 2 on my list is the formation of Canadian National in the period between 1917 and 1923. It came out of the wreckage of various railways that had suffered from overbuilding and from the demands of the World War on their infrastructure. Number 3 on my list is the radical change in technology that occurred between the late 1940s and the early 1960s, particularly the change from steam to diesel motive power and the adoption of centralized traffic control, which enables a train dispatcher in a central location to automatically route trains and decide where trains are going to meet, and took a lot of the safety aspects that were enforced out in the field and moved them to headquarters. Around this time, by the early 60s, we were starting to see punch cards and primitive computers replacing pencils and green eye shades. And I should say, by way of a personal note, Boston and Maine was a little bit behind the rest of the industry. And when I started in 1970, we were still in the pencil and green eye shade stage. So I had some personal experience with that. Number 4 on my list is the diversification of Canadian Pacific that started in 1962 and accelerated through the 1970s, but was followed by the unwinding of that corporate structure with the 2001 separation of the railway from the remaining businesses that were in the CP portfolio, including shipping, coal, petroleum, and real estate. Finally, the 5th item on my list was the privatization of CN in 1995, which resulted, among other things, in CN being owned predominantly by US investors. And I suspect that CP is in that same situation, really, simply because there are more of us investors in the US than there are in Canada. I'd like to go back for a moment and look at the first of those milestones, the completion of CP across Canada, because I think it has a bearing on why we're gathered here today. The decision of CP's builders to route the railway as close to the US border as possible, which was both political and a desire to keep Jim Hill, the great builder of the Great Northern, out of Canada to the extent possible. This decision resulted in some engineering challenges, notably the crossings of the Rockies and the Selkirks in the west, as well as a rugged route along the north shore of Lake Superior. Railway engineer Sanford Fleming had proposed a route via Yellowhead Pass to the north in the vicinity of Jasper, Alberta today. But that route, because of the choices made by the builders of CP and subsequent developments, is today operated by CN, not CP, giving CN a permanent cost and operational advantage in transcontinental business. In the railway business, engineering is destiny. CN today has a superior competitive position relative to CP. Its more favorable crossing of the divide is one of the reasons for this. Another is the fact that CN serves Canada's 4 largest container ports: Vancouver, Montreal, Halifax, and Prince Rupert, whereas CP serves only the first 2. CP's access to Mexico will now give it something that CN lacks, and it will have an opportunity to make itself the most international railroad of any in North America. That wraps up my prepared remarks. I'll be happy to answer questions when the time comes.
Thanks very much, Tom. Great historical roundup. Let's now go to Gordon in Kelowna. And Gordon, please, as I said, bring us up to speed on the key issues facing the industry right now, from environmental to tech to financial, labor, competitive, and so forth.
Sure. Well, that was a wonderful introduction and setup, Tom. Thank you very much. I think we could have just listened to you for the whole time and been fully satisfied. That was just wonderful. Thank you again.
Thank you.
So, and I was going to talk about deregulation, so tick that off. But let's just say, if anybody doesn't know it, let me say what everybody should know. In the railway sector, margins are slim and mines are risk averse. It's goes without saying, every approach to change is looked at from a, if it ain't broke, don't fix it perspective. That goes with technology and everything else. So the fact that CP is going after this big a change tells you, I think back to what Tom's saying, the pain to change is less than the pain to stay where you are. So talking about it a little bit more organically. And I can tell you the financial regulations, despite we can talk about deregulation to stay competitive, I get the sense with the USA first, Canada first mentality, CP is going after this as much to get their network to other ports, as Tom so beautifully pointed out, but for the sake of network control, contiguity, not just continuity, but contiguity right down to Mexico, control over their corridor. We know freight 40% plus is moved by rail across North America, a huge contribution to GDP north and south of the border. It's the postal service of freight. It's slow, but it's sure. It gets there. Not only that, they are there when it comes in big part to disaster recovery, disaster relief. Very, very strong cultural tradition behind railways. The concern, though, and the tension I'm seeing as a professor, a researcher, an academic in this area, and my affiliations, as the public, shareholders, and governments are causing tensions regarding, obviously, doing the right thing, and when it comes to the climate. And yet the pushback from rail always has been, every meeting I'm in, they remind us, listen, rail accounts for less than 4%. So if we talk about the environment, rail accounts for less than 4% of greenhouse gas emissions. You can go to the Railway Association of Canada, and it's right on their website, the briefing to the federal government and the new minister, who's pretty well the old minister, obviously, the same minister as before. We do great service, and in their memorandum of understanding with Transport Canada, basically the regulator, they have been decreasing those greenhouse gas emissions. Every 5 to 10 years, they update it, and you can go online. It's publicly available on the RAC website. You can see the latest MOU between the railways and the government of Canada. The only increased issue is that diesel electrics, when it comes to urban interface issues, and this is the gist of some of the drive behind technology and a push for regulations, is that at the urban interface is where you get the most polluting, oldest, most vibrating, emitting locomotives. All the yard switchers, short duty cycles, emit the most pollution, well above their representation. They're overrepresented, and most nuisance comes from. So in BC, for example, our Southern Railway of BC industry partner, you can see it behind me. It's one of their locomotives are retrofitting to become zero emission. They're now being fined, or I guess the political term is non-attainment fees for every horsepower below tier. I can't remember exactly the tier, but every horsepower they're getting a financial hit that's now driving their business case to change. So moving on though, in a risk-averse industry, the tension now is our prime minister, our leaders north and south of the US are now both pushing for drastic greenhouse gas emissions. And the question for rail is, are they moving fast enough? So this is the environment we're in, is regulation versus relationship. So far, the MOUs, railway working with government regulators as opposed to being regulated to change, have worked well, but many say it's too slow and we now need to quote the UN drastic action. So change will happen quicker if you regulate. Everybody knows that, but it's painful. The only big difference in my mind, or driving regulation, I've had conversations as recently as yesterday, they expect it to come down, is that it levels the playing field, adds predictability, and that cost of business, the increase due to regs and change, can be passed on to customers. So let's talk about technology. Right now, we've got locomotive fleets on average over 30 years old. We've got 25,000 locomotives. Those aren't going to be replaced overnight. In fact, the business case, the science, the evidence points to retrofits as the low-hanging fruit. That's where we need to go. So you see railways across North America. One just in California, we're working with both the government there, the state, and railways. We're working, well, CP themselves has something of a skunk works, and shout out to RailwayAge about what they're doing with zero emissions, right? I've already talked about SRY. So it's happening. And the question everybody's got is, well, do we go tier 4? Do we go to a cleaner locomotive? Or do we wait for somebody else to develop a new one or a retrofit kit? And it's a question of leapfrog, replacement economics. The early innovation, the risk-averse industry often goes out of business. Do we go there, or do we risk getting left behind if we don't go there? So what my research is doing is trying to drive down the cost of a retrofit zero-emission kit using hydrogen fuel cells with a battery hybrid, because we know hydrogen onboard storage, overhead catenary or third rail electrification makes no sense. So going zero emission, pretty well, you're talking about electrification. How do you get your energy to move this thing? Hydrogen is an energy carrier. The key there is it's not about safety. Safety, it's just like diesel and gasoline. There is no added risk. Supply, there's more than 4 or 5 different ways to get hydrogen. Supply is not actually the issue. Don't let that red herring distract you. The bigger issue is to fit it in there so that the driver can accept it and it transitions smoothly. It's always the transition, right? Whether it's transition to change a season or whatever it is. So how do we do it in a way that we can get these individual units retrofitted one at a time, and they can work in a distributed power network? So Tom, you understand where I'm going with this. I don't know, with train consists, how many people are aware of it, but obviously it's not just one locomotive typically pulling a freight consist, between 1,000 kilometers. It's several, and they have to work together as a team. Getting a power control module in there that looks, feels, but doesn't smell like a diesel electric control is key to the drivers accepting this. They need to be trained, but they also need to feel the lead lag as if it's a diesel and it works well in a team. That is absolutely critical. The other critical thing about technology is hydrogen, as we all know, is a gas, typically water. So we're working with industry to do a 14-fold pressure reduction in hydrogen. Why that's critical is right now we use these massively inefficient spun fiber hydrogen fuel tanks, and there just isn't enough space on board. You have to add a tender, it's another vehicle. It's operationally impractical, unaffordable. So to get that storage dealt with, there's new nanotechnology research going on. Again, we're working with industry, it's off the lab, it's now being scaled up. And that, as I was talking to one of my railway colleagues only a couple of days ago, has turned the corner. It's now practical. This is why CP and SR are going there. And the last point I'll say is what's critical here and in Canada, we're talking about just transition, is we need to look at job skills, employment and skills training. We've learned a lot from BNSF's Hydril 2008, 2009. We're learning as we go. I'm talking about maintenance staff, a new fleet of engineers coming out of universities across the continent, and managers, everybody in between. There are going to be some aspects of obviously financing involved in all this. The last comment I'll make is that right now, rail corridors right across North America, I don't have to say this probably either, are congested. So it's a battle for control. And especially when it comes to regional intercity passenger rail, that's being revitalized. And you're going to see a renaissance north-south. And so last comment, Howard, because I see you you're fidgeting, you're getting uncomfortable, or you're making notes. I'm probably up on my time here. That CP is absolutely fantastic strategically, I think. And I'm only guessing, I don't know this, but clearly they want to get product to market, but they also want to have control over their own north-south corridor. It's think about climate migrants and refugees. Well, having this north-south corridor and more port of access gives them the ability to, shall we call it, diversify the risk. It gives them control, more control. And think about future markets, supply of hydrogen. It's not just about oil by rail anymore. They're going to be able to get their hydrogen back forth, eco-tourists, and they, depending on where this goes, I actually see a huge potential for intercity regional passenger, which would have been my background when I originally signed on. But for now, it's all about freight. Back to you, Howard. Howard, did we lose you?
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you go. You're there.
Yeah, am I here? Okay. Apparently my internet connection is unstable. That's what I just got, that message. Anyhow, thanks, Gordon. Cameron, let's get a market perspective from you on this. What does this transaction mean for investors and the shape of the industry to come?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks very much, Howard. And also wanted to thank the CBHA for inviting me to participate in the discussion today. So as you mentioned, I'm going to focus my comments this afternoon on the financial and strategic importance of the merger. But just before I proceed, I just want to emphasize that, and I think most of you know this, but the merger is not yet a done deal. And just as a reminder, we still have to have the shareholder meetings for both CP and KCS, which are currently scheduled for early December. The merger must also be approved by the Mexican regulatory authorities. I don't see any issues here, but in my view, that is probably not going to happen until early 2022. And after those steps, the CP can then close KCS into an independent voting trust, and then the Surface Transportation Board is going to conduct its full merger review. And just as a reminder, CP already does have approval for the use of a voting trust structure. So the STB merger review is going to take probably until sometime later in 2022. And assuming that there are no major issues, CP could then take full control of the KCS and start integrating operations. All that said, my personal view here is that there is a high likelihood that the STB is ultimately going to approve the merger. So, first off, some thoughts on the strategic and financial implications here. And, really, the KCS network is a very attractive asset for a merger partner. And there's a couple of reasons for that, in my view. Obviously, its US network stretches down the middle of the country, and it has extensive reach into the Gulf Coast region and Texas. And it is also a key interchange partner with all of the other North American Class I rails. And as was mentioned earlier, through its wholly owned Mexican subsidiary, the KCS can provide seamless single carrier access to a network that services Mexico's industrial heartland. So, the current oligopolistic structure of the North American railroad industry, as Tom mentioned, was really built through M&A. And, the new stricter rules that came in 2001 really made additional large-scale mergers between Class I railroads, nearly impossible. But the one possible exception to that rule was the KCS. Now, the KCS certainly has more significant network overlap with the U.S. Class I rails, which I think kind of effectively ruled out getting regulatory approval for a merger between KCS and one of the U.S. railroads. And as such, CP or CN were probably the only realistic merger partners for KCS. And the KCS was especially attractive to the Canadian railroads because adding its network would give either CP or CN the most extensive network serving all three North American economies. CP probably always had the distinct regulatory advantage over CN in trying to get a merger completed because CP has no network overlap with KCS. So I really do believe that the merger between KCS and CP Rail really addresses two areas of focus for railroad investors, those being the outlook for long-term growth and continuous operating improvement. And firstly, the merger is a rare inorganic growth opportunity in the railroad industry. And I would agree with Tom. I do think the CP-KCS merger may be the last Class 1 railroad merger. And that really explains why CP and CN were so aggressively pursuing KCS. Secondly, the CP-KCS merger should accelerate organic growth. And there's several specific opportunities on that front. Firstly, the merger is going to create single line competition for rail intermodal flows between Mexico, Texas, and the US Gulf Coast to the US Upper Midwest and Canada. And if more manufacturing does nearshore to Mexico, as many expect will be the case, this will be a solid growth vector over the longer term. Another interesting fact here is that the rail distance from Mexico's Pacific ports to Chicago is not actually significantly longer than from Los Angeles to Chicago. So the merged entity may actually compete for more container volumes from shipping lines looking to diversify their West Coast ports of call. Second opportunity I see here is having a more efficient single line between Mexico and the US and Canada should also be more attractive to shippers as an alternative to trucking. The total value of goods shipped between Mexico and the US by rail is less than 20% of that shipped by truck. And the potential intermodal truck conversion opportunity has been pegged at around $6 billion. So this could be a major driver of organic revenue growth. A third area opportunity is on grain. CP has an extensive grain origination network in Western Canada and the US Midwest, while the KCS services a large grain destination network in Mexico. So the combined entity will really create more efficient shipping options for grain exporters and importers. In petrochemicals, CP and KCS already interchange a decent amount of traffic, but the merged network will offer new single line competition between two of North America's largest oil and gas regions in Alberta and the Gulf Coast. And really the final organic growth opportunity I see here is in automotive. Mexico's auto production is forecasted to increase about 20% over the next 5 years. So the merged railroad will have a more competitive offering for the movement of both finished vehicles and auto parts between Mexico and the key manufacturing regions in the US and Southern Ontario. The other thing that I mentioned earlier as a desire from investors, and that is to see continuous operating improvements. Look from a financial perspective, this merger is going to increase CP's revenue by about 45%. So it is very significant. And based on our math, it would be double-digit accretive for CP's earnings per share as cost and revenue synergies are realized. I also see major network enhancements that are going to drive more volumes and operating improvements. Given that today CP's network is predominantly East-West Canada in orientation and its reach into the US was somewhat limited, the CP's future growth was likely going to be constrained, but the combined CP-KCS network is going to be arguably among the best in North America. And really more specifically, the combined railroad is going to be the only North American railroad with extensive operations in each of the three North American economies. So it's going to become a very significant facilitator of growing north-south trade flows. Secondly, as mentioned earlier about the ports, CP's only Pacific gateway right now is Vancouver, but the combined entity, CPKCS, will have 2 Pacific ports with the addition of Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico. So that gives it some diversification. And finally, CP's network is going to allow for trains to and from Western Canada to point south to effectively bypass Chicago, which is generally considered a significant choke point in the North American railway network. Our final point on the operations side is that the North American railroad industry has aggressively embraced the operating concepts of precision scheduled railroading, or more commonly called PSR. KCS's implementation of PSR is relatively more recent, whereas both of the Canadian railroads under the prior leadership of Hunter Harrison were really leaders in this operating philosophy. So we would expect that CP will be able to refine PSR concepts at KCS once the full merger is approved and the integration progresses, which I think will further boost operating efficiency across the entire network. So just the second brief comment I just wanted to make was just about what the merger means for the broader industry. And to be sure, there's going to be some competitive implications here for the entire North American railroad industry. And I'll start, just to be specific on the impact on CN Rail. And recall, as Tom mentioned earlier, CN completed a similar strategic move to gain access to north-south trade and access to the U.S. Gulf Coast through the acquisition of the Illinois Central back in the late 1990s. And though it was not successful in its pursuit of KCS, I do think that CN is going to continue to have one of the best networks in North America because they will have access to the multiple ports on three coasts, and they also have an important bypass route around Chicago that is a key competitive advantage. However, the CP-KCS merger does have some competitive implications for CN here. Firstly, with more efficient single line service and direct access into Mexico, CP will potentially have a competitive advantage on north-south intermodal and automotive volumes to the US Midwest and Canada. And in addition, CN previously had the only direct line service from Western Canada into the US Gulf Coast, which gave it a leg up on petrochemical and other volumes. And now that CP will no longer have to interchange with another carrier to reach south of Kansas City, it will be a more competitive alternative. As for the US railroads, clearly KCS is a key partner for US Class 1 railroads access into Mexico. And I think of the US railroads, Union Pacific may be feeling the most threatened here because it is currently the largest cross-border US-Mexico railroad, and a merged CPKCS will have a more competitive service offering between Mexico and Chicago in the upper Midwest. What we would not expect to happen as a result of the merger is the triggering of additional mergers between Class 1 railroads. Firstly, with its rejection of CN's voting trust application, the STB made it pretty clear that the regulatory hurdle for approving a Class 1 rail merger, even one with only limited competitive overlap, will be very high, making it, I think, nearly impossible for further mergers. Secondly, the CP-KCS merger uniquely has very little, if any negative implications competitively. And that is because it is a true end-to-end merger. The two railroads have basically no network overlap, and they only have one connecting point in Kansas City. The combined entity will also be the smallest Class 1 railroad even after the merger, as measured by revenue. And the merged railroad truly will enhance competition. Indeed, the STB itself has stated that the combination of the two networks would carry the, quote, potential to increase both efficiency and competition for the benefit of shippers. Mm-hmm. The final point I'll just make here just briefly is, just want to reflect a little bit on the future challenges in the railroad industry and, how these may be actually addressed specifically by the merger. One of the, I think, most topical things we hear about out there today, it's in the news on, virtually every company reporting in the last number of weeks, and that's supply chain challenges. And really the whole transportation industry is currently facing pretty severe challenges, and especially with certain bottlenecks, one of those being port congestion. And as I mentioned earlier, the merged CPKC could offer a more efficient intermodal service that could make Mexico's Pacific container ports more viable alternatives to LA Long Beach, which is currently the one port that is the most backed up. The combined railroad will also offer more efficient service if nearshoring of supply chains to Mexico does take hold in the wake of all these supply chain challenges. The other one, just to echo Gordon's earlier comments is around environmental considerations. Really all transportation companies are going to feel increased pressure to reduce their carbon footprint. And to that end, actually, the merged CPKC should be able to offer a more competitive and environmentally friendlier alternative to long-haul trucking. And moving more volumes to rail may also address some of the near-term truck driver shortage that we're seeing out there. And the final, I think, thing to watch here from an industry point of view is around regulation. And there's definitely been some recent criticism of the railroad industry from STB members specifically, suggesting that the rails are prioritizing cost cutting and the pursuit of lower operating ratios at the expense of service to shippers. While this is not, I don't think, necessarily a harbinger of new regulations, I do think it is something that we're going to need to watch here over the next number of years. CP and KC have pitched the merger as a pro-growth merger and offering new competitive options for shippers. So one would think that the STB will be supportive in that regard. So, I'll stop there and I'll turn it back over to Howard, and certainly happy to answer any questions that come up.
Thanks so much, Cameron. Actually, let me ask the first question here based on what you finished with. If you're, and respecting what you said, that this is not yet a done deal, it still has to go through those final regulatory phases. If you're a member of the STB, and you look at this, who's going to benefit most from this deal? Shareholders or a broader array of stakeholders? I know you mentioned a broader array of stakeholders, but railroads for the last couple of decades have really been a shareholder play. At least that seems to be the view of the chair of the STB. So how do you get past that?
Yeah, no, very good question. I mean, remember that, I guess the first point to be made here is that, the merger itself is going to be viewed by the STB under the old merger rules. So the hurdle that they're going to need to meet here is lower than would be the case with a different two companies merging. So, if you think about the new merger rules really required that any merger would have to enhance competition, which obviously is a very difficult thing to show. But as I mentioned, there's going to be a lower hurdle here in the case of CP-KCS. But I think more importantly, yes, I think it is a positive for shareholders. Obviously, for KCS, they're getting a significant premium to where the stock was trading prior to all the activity here. But I think also longer term, strategically for CP, it's going to be good for shareholders. But there's been some pretty solid support from shippers as well. As I mentioned, there's no network overlap here. The two companies meet at one point in Kansas City, so it will create a more efficient shipping options and new shipping options for shippers. So it doesn't seem to me as though that the shipping community is going to be overly concerned by this. In fact, they've certainly been some encouraging words from many of the shipper groups suggesting that this is going to give them more shipping options. So it seems to me like the STB is going to certainly take those things into consideration, but from a competitive point of view, I think it actually does enhance competition. And from an impacting shipper point of view, I think on balance, it's going to be positive for shippers. So, my personal view is that the STB is going to take all that into consideration. And I think there's a high likelihood they're going to view this merger as one that's approvable.
Tom, let me go to you on this because you've been in railroading, as I said in the intro, since 1970, which is a long time, and you have seen a lot of consolidation in your time. I don't know how many Class I railroads there were in 1970, but dozens, I'm sure.
More than that.
More than that. Okay. So on this, let me just ask a follow-up to what I asked Cameron. Why is consolidation even necessary? We've got an oligopoly of 7 big railroads in North America. Canada has 6 big banks. They're not allowed to merge, and they do just fine. Is this necessary? Can the world go on without this merger?
I think the world could go on very well without the merger, but I can understand what Cameron was just saying about the weight of merger arguments going in favor of shareholders as opposed to the public. But in this case, I think there is, from the standpoint of the economy of Canada and even the economy of Mexico, joining these two countries, which are linked through the various international trade agreements anyway. I think in a meaningful way, it'll promote international trade. And one thing in particular that I wanted to bring up that I don't think Cameron mentioned in terms of the benefits of something like this is every time you see an aerial image of a border crossing point between Mexico and the US, you see 18-wheelers backed up for miles. And I think there is one of the rationales you often hear for railroad mergers is we'll be able to take business away from the trucks. And it rarely happens. This may be the exception, particularly in today's environment of a shortage of truck drivers and just the congestion at the border, as I said. So I think this merger has some things that can be said for it, aside from the benefit to shareholders.
That's kind of a natural opening for you, Gordon, on the environmental side. If I can come to you, you gave us a lot of interesting background there, but specifically, if you can talk about this transaction itself, how does this transaction, in your view, address the climate change issue, which is staring us all in the face right now?
It's a good question. I'm all about system efficiency, and I think both Cameron and Tom have made comments to that point about, for example, the competitive with long haul trucking. I think that would probably be the best follow up. Absolutely agree that trucks, long haul trucks, 1/3 as efficient under current technology. Yes, they're going electric, but they're going to go shorter haul. Their competitiveness with battery electric isn't necessarily going to mean a good thing for long haul trucking. So instead, what the trucking industry is pushing, and the good news is CP has and CN both have trucking as well, part of their intermodal, but they're pushing for longer trains. So Rocky Mountain doubles, so 2 trailers, and in I don't know which states, but now 3 trailers. They're trying to push back. Trucks beat up our highways. They are really rough, and do they pay their fair share? Those are the kinds of operational maintenance debates that highway authorities, the public road authorities, have to worry about versus privately owned railways that are responsible for maintaining their own infrastructure and can do so much more efficiently. And we've seen a decline, and now we're seeing a comeback in so many big ways. So actually, the next point of congestion is going to be railway cars. And in fact, somebody's already mentioned the technology idea of well, if you have automation and types of control. So environmentally, Howard, it's going to, I think, come down to, shall I call it a mode switch? Maybe that's the best way to say it, is you're going to get more polluting alternatives, and CP's acquisition will provide an economic substitute. So cheaper shipping, more efficient shipping, and cleaner shipping, just by virtue, even if they didn't go zero emission, just by virtue of being more competitive with truck.
Mm-hmm. I'm just seeing, thank you. I'm just seeing a few things in chat now. Somebody's asking about Burlington Northern, William. And of course, Burlington Northern is the one that's not publicly traded. It's owned by Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company. The question is it the next? I think you said, Cameron, that there aren't going to be any more deals. Burlington Northern, by the way, is enormous. So it would take a UP to buy that, wouldn't it? If that were even possible. And they're both west of the Mississippi. So that would seem to me that's highly unlikely. Cameron?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think, we basically have regional duopolies, right? In the railroad industry, you've got UP and BN in the West, and CSX and Norfolk Southern in the East of the US, and then the 2 Canadian rails, which now will both have kind of a north-south down the middle of the US. So yeah, you're never going to see, regulatory approval for, BN and UP to merge, or the 2 Eastern rails to merge. I mean, you could maybe make the argument that there's less overlap between, one of the West Coast rails, one of the East Coast rails. But again, the STB was pretty clear, in the case of rejecting CN's voting trust, that even the limited overlap there was causing them some concerns from a competitive point of view. And, the current administration in the US, I think, has made it pretty clear that they're not really in favor of additional mergers, not just within railroads, but across all industries. So at least in the current, STB and regulatory environment that's out there, I think it's highly unlikely we're going to see any of the other Class 1 rails merge together.
Maybe I can throw this one to you, Tom. It's from Dennis. Would you be able to talk a bit more about Mexico's railway laws? KCS doesn't own its rails in Mexico, according to Dennis. And what's the risk of cancellation / change to its concession agreement? It's an interesting question, because I remember in speaking to Hunter Harrison when he was still with us, he was always nervous about what he termed the Mexico risk if you bought KCS. And I think perhaps that question speaks to it. Tom?
I agree. It's kind of a wild card because the Mexican regulators have been a little unpredictable in the past. and things that would seem to be no-brainers somehow get a great deal of scrutiny down there. I think the real risk is longer term, and I believe 2047 is the expiration date of the current KCS franchise in Mexico, and who knows what might happen at that time. But in the near term, I think you're right in suggesting that the Mexican regulators are going to bear careful watching from anybody with a stake in the outcome of this merger right now.
Maybe I can ask a follow-up of you as the American on our panel. What about Biden risk to this transaction? I mean, Joe Biden doesn't seem to want big in the corporate world. Well,
and I think that's being expressed through the Surface Transportation Board, as Cameron has alluded to. We have people on the board now who are not eager to see further aggregation of the large systems that we have now, and Kansas City Southern fortunately got a pass on having to meet the current STB standards, and they've already approved the voting trust before CN came along. They've approved the voting trust with CP. So I'm not worried about what'll happen there, but I think the Biden risk is already factored into the equation.
Gordon, back to you. How, just on trying to get this thing through final approval, how much do they have to emphasize the improvements from an environmental point of view in order to make this something that the STB wants to go, yes, we want this?
Well, what a wonderful question. I was actually going to ask that to Cameron, because their issue, what I heard Cameron say was about competitiveness, ensuring increased or healthy competition. Is there a mechanism where they consider the externalities here? In all my transport economics and research discussions with my research team, I'm now saying, have you internalized the externalities here? Shareholders, the public, regulators, government are all looking at that, at most, I should say, and absolutely. So if the chairman and that group of regulators reviewing this acquisition are actually considering that, and hearing our discussion and the potential that this has, Stephen, I think there's spillover to revitalizing regional intercity passenger rail. I'm very confident, but again, Cameron, Tom, you folks know what criteria they're looking at. That's beyond my pay grade. Let's put it that way.
Maybe Cameron, we can go right back to you and you can jump in.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, I haven't seen anything that sort of specifically says that there's going to be, environmental considerations in the STB review. I think they primarily are looking at, competitive impacts, any downstream impacts with regards to, further mergers, impact on shippers, things like that. But that said, I mean, the STB has a pretty broad mandate. And so if that's one of the items that they consider important, I'm sure that is something that will be taken into consideration. And look, I mean, if you think about the environmental impact, to me, a merger has to be a net positive, right? I mean, taking the trucks off the road we talked about, I mean, if there was no merger, you'd still have this, effectively a similar amount of railway traffic running independently on Kansas City Southern and CP. So, I think you can only make the case really that the merger between the two is going to be a net positive from an network efficiency point of view, and therefore also the ability to take more polluting trucks off the road and reducing congestion. So even if the STB does review environmental considerations, it's hard to see where they would come down and say we'd be better off without a merger.
Mm-hmm. I just see a note from Gord that you have to head out to a meeting. So we thank you for your participation, Gord. We're almost out of time anyway, but I just want to go back to Tom for a last comment on that. on that issue. It seemed like the environmental issue was top of mind when CP made its initial bid. It was right there, front and center in their release about the rail car versus truck emissions issue. So how important do you think that's going to be?
I don't think that's going to swing any regulator's decision one way or the other. I think it's something you have to mention. You have to point to the environmental advantage that rails have over trucks, and where you're hoping to transfer some of that business from truck to rail. That gives you something to talk about, but I don't think it's going to swing any decisions.
All right, well, we're almost out of time, and I have to say a couple of things before we wrap up here. But I first of all, I want to thank our panelists, Gord, who's already departed, Tom in California. Thank you so much for making time for us. Cameron in Montreal. Great to have all of your insights on this and your contributions today. I'd like to thank all of you for watching as well, and thanks to our production team, Tabitha Fritz and her team, and of course, Mark Bonham for leading us off here today, Dimitri Anastakis, and Joe Martin for their tireless work on behalf of the CBHA, and once again, thanks to our series sponsor, National Bank of Canada. I'd also like to remind everybody that we have another talk coming up on December 16th at 2 p.m. You won't want to miss this one, Fortunes and Family Feuds, the checkered history of family-controlled public companies in Canada. Gee, I wonder what might come up in that one. Maybe you want to read the newspaper and see. Anyway, we'll be fascinated by that. It will be led by Dimitri Anastakis, president of the CBHA, and is guaranteed to be fascinating. So stay tuned for information on upcoming panelists for that one on family businesses. And a final note, as I said off the top, if you have not already joined the Canadian Business History Association, please do so. Go to our website to do so. Thanks so much, everybody. And if you missed this, it's been recorded, or you missed part of it, go to our YouTube channel. In about a week, it'll be up there. And take care of yourselves, and see you next time.